Section 230 is a law from 1996 that gives internet publishers like YouTube or Facebook immunity from liability for content that users post through their distribution networks. So, if I post a video defaming Jeff Bezos, although he can sue me for making the video and tarnishing his reputation, he can't sue YouTube for hosting the video. In this way, Section 230 acts as a shield for internet platforms against lawsuits claiming that the user-generated material on their sites is illegal or harmful in some way. Section 230 says that the platform is not to blame, they're just the host of the content. This is good for platforms that host user-generated content, good for the jobs and the economic activity that they create, and good for their users, perhaps. However, if all this user-generated content spreads disinformation, harms democracy, and wildly empowers big tech, maybe Section 230 is not so good. Overall, Americans are divided on the subject. 41% say people should be able to sue social media companies for user posts. 56% say people should not be able to sue these companies. With that divide, this makes a great debate topic. Welcome to Debate Trek, where we do deep, expert-backed dives into policy topics for public forum debate and for anyone who wants to learn. Today, U.S. Code, Title 47, Chapter 5, Subchapter 2, Part 1, Section 230. This lecture will be structured in terms of a debate resolution. First AF, which argues for the abolishment of Section 230, then Neg, which argues for the status quo, keeping Section 230. Here is that resolution. The United States federal government should repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. As usual, all evidence cited in this video is available at debatetrack.com, linked below. There, subscribers will also find a sheet of pre-written rebuttals. I've also included for all of you, for everyone, an Anki Deck of flashcards to study for the topic that is linked in the description. This is a method to give you powerful knowledge depth in round. Please try them, it's a small deck, but if you find them useful, I will keep making them. If you'd like to skip to arguments for and against Section 230, you can find timestamps in the comments. Otherwise, let's dive into some background. Let's set the scene. The year is 1996, 28 years ago. This is 11 years before the first iPhone, 14 years before Instagram, and 20 years before TikTok. Internet connections were slow and noisy. In fact, let's listen to some of the music from early internet history. Such a soothing way to get online. Once online, websites were clunky text and basic graphics, and maybe a pixelated GIF if you were lucky. Really early cave paintings of the internet. There were 45 million people using the internet, 45 times less than the current number of Instagram users. Cell phones existed, but they looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. This is 1996, the year Section 230 was written. But in order to find the origins of Section 230, we have to go back further, to 1991, the year I was born, before Section 230 was written. In fact, 5 years before it was written. In Cubby versus CompuServe, a federal judge ruled that CompuServe, an internet forum provider, was not liable for slander against Cubby because it had no knowledge of a libelous post made by the user of its platform. Here's a quote, Jurisich 22. CompuServe could not be held liable for allegedly defamatory posts published on its platform, on the grounds that CompuServe was passively hosting the material without moderating or reviewing it, like a bookstore stocking a wide range of volumes. Just like a bookstore, CompuServe couldn't be expected to know the contents of every piece of content on its site. End quote. 1995, Prezi versus Stratton Oakmont. This is 1 year before Section 230. A New York judge ruled that Prezi was liable for slander against Stratton Oakmont because it did moderate content on its platform. Quote, cause of 22. Because Prezi had reviewed user messages before posting, used technology that pre-screened user content for offensive language, and engaged in other moderation, Its editorial control rendered it a publisher that faced as much liability as the author of the posts, end quote. Internet publishers were in a bind. The only way to avoid a similar ruling to Prodigy was to, like CompuServe, avoid moderation altogether. And this isn't a good way to make an internet. Even in those early days, it was apparent that these incentives to not moderate would lead to more lewd and defamatory content on the increasingly growing internet. Protecting the children was the main ethos, and thus Section 230 was born. Now, to win a debate on Section 230, we must first understand Section 230. For debaters, you might want to go read it in full. For everyone else, here is the heart of the law. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So, this law stipulates two things. One of them we just heard. Number one, a computer service provider can't be treated as a publisher or speaker of content. And number two, a computer service provider can take down any content they want, whether or not it's constitutionally protected. This may already be covered by the First Amendment's freedom of association, but Section 230 makes it doubly clear. The law also explicitly gives carve-outs for some things, like certain sexually exploitive materials. Intellectual property law and communications privacy laws are also mentioned. This is copyright materials and hacking. You're not allowed to do them, even under Section 230. And platforms can certainly be held liable under these different laws. And of course, illegal things are still illegal. If you use a platform to commit a crime, you as a user can still be held liable. But under Section 230, the platform won't be. Another question that may come up is AI-generated content covered under Section 230. It seems probably not, as AI technologies count as the platform generating the content, not the users. It is, however, an open question that has yet to be decided by the courts. Next, let's look at some more case law, the times that this law has been challenged and upheld in lawsuits since 1996. 1996, Republican Chris Cox and Democrat Ron Wyden authored Section 230 to fix the perverse incentives created by Cubby and Prodigy. For the next 28 years and longer, Americans would debate its merits. 1997, the court ruled that under Section 230, America Online was not responsible for a fake ad that was put up with the phone number of Zeron, the defendant. The fake ads, by the way, featured t-shirts with slogans like, "Visit Oklahoma, it's a blast," 6 days after the Oklahoma City bombings. The defendant understandably got a great many angry and threatening phone calls, but again, AOL was not responsible. 2003, Betzel v. Smith ruled that emails were protected under Section 230. Again, AOL was not responsible. 2016, Doe v. Backpage found Backpage was not liable for facilitating sex trafficking, showing that Section 230 protections could be enforced even when serious crimes were involved. 2017, Herrick v. Grindr. The case ruled in favor of Grindr, which a user used to harass another user in real life. Again, 230 protections applied. Using the app to cause real-world harm was not reason for Grindr to be held liable. 2018, Fosta Sesta. These were Senate and House bills, not court cases, that amended Section 230 to add a provision for sex trafficking. That the law now says is that these platforms can be held liable for user-posted material if it involves these crimes. 2019 to 23, Force v. Facebook, Gonzalez v. Google, Twitter vs. Tamina. These cases, along with others, ruled that 230 protections from charges these platforms help to facilitate terrorist activity, and that their recommendation algorithms help to indoctrinate, radicalize, and recruit terrorists. Again, that is the terrorist's fault. It is not the platform's responsibility. 2023, Omegle v. AM. As you may know, the video chatting with strangers site Omegle is now down. Why? A court ruled that Omegle was liable for pairing an 11-year-old girl with a pedophile, because Omegle was aware that pedophiles used their platform but did nothing to stop it. This likely is not a challenge to Section 230, but an acknowledgement under Fosta Sesta that there should be some limits to these protections. Now, Today's debate topic asks if we should repeal, get rid of, cancel, and annihilate Section 230 or not. Short of repealing the law, there have been a number of suggestions for reform, including 25 separate reform bills in the 117th Congress. These include carve-outs, meaning Section 230 immunities would not apply to cyber stalking, online harassment, or discrimination, find that in Brand 23, and also include methods to enforce neutrality, implement tiered regulation depending on platform size, and to regulate content moderation with AI. That's Romanoff 23, or 22. Two of the best reform suggestions that I personally came across were, one, a tiered approach, coming from Fisherman 23, where more complex applications have to do more reporting than less complex applications. This would put regulations on internet platforms without becoming overly biased towards these large monopolies like Facebook. Number two, cool methods that I found, post-reporting enforcement, where platforms would have to take down content after they were alerted to it. This is similar to how copyright laws work now. If you post a pirated movie to YouTube, YouTube is not immediately responsible, but as soon as someone reports it to YouTube, like whoever owns the copyright, YouTube then becomes responsible for dealing with it. The same process could hold true for defamatory or other illegal content. This would again hold platforms accountable without putting a large weight of litigious pressure on them from lawyers who want to make a quick buck. Okay, now before diving into argumentation, let's look at why and how internet platforms currently control user-generated content. But first, a brief note on these proposed reforms. Of course, these do not exactly apply to our debate because we're talking about abolishing and not abolishing Section 230, not reforming it. However, these reforms are very likely to pop up in the debate somewhere or another, so it's worth knowing about how some of these work. And if you are on the affirmative team, it is worth knowing that negative will probably try to run some of these things. If you're on the negative team, you might try to run some of these things, even though technically it is not allowed. Okay, again, now modern regulation. How does it actually work in the real world right now? First question, why would platforms even want to control content if Section 230 gives them immunity from lawsuits? Why bother? First, because users and advertisers, who are the customers of these platforms, expect a certain level of quality from a platform. Social platforms filled with smut and tabloid posts could be repulsive to people and companies who may not want their handmade soap advertised along adult-themed content. Twitter/X, for example, has experienced advertiser flight in response to an apparent increase in hate speech posts. Again, you do not want your debate channel alongside anti-Semitic posts, so you just don't advertise there. Second, platforms want to avoid scrutiny. If big tech platforms can show that they've taken steps to avoid harm by themselves, they may hope to avoid public criticism for the spread of misinformation or congressional ire for allowing election interference. Again, you've probably seen big tech CEOs dragged before Congress. This keeps happening. Those big tech CEOs don't want Congress to crack down even more on their platforms. Last, even Section 230 has its limits, so keeping platforms clear of terrorism, exploitative content, and other potentially litigious areas can help to keep platforms out of legal trouble. These all contribute to a positive brand image and ultimately help a platform's bottom line. Okay, for the how of platform regulation, this section will seem a bit pedantic. I promise it's the most boring section of the video, but knowing these steps can help to prepare you for why platforms should, or why they absolutely cannot exist in a post-230 world. These details, by the way, these all come from Brian Fisherman. Brian is a senior counterterrorism fellow at New America. This section includes quotes from him. Let us begin. First, to enforce content regulations, platforms must write rules. Quote, such policies are organized around actors, rules addressing certain people or groups like Nazis, behavior, rules addressing certain digital actions regardless of content like spam or creating fake accounts, and content, rules describing acceptable behavior on the platform itself like bullying or hate speech, end quote. These rules necessitate defining harm assessing whether entities meet the definition of harm, defining what constitutes a violation of the rule, identify the signals or indicators the platform should look for, and scope the consequences for rule violation. In other words, you break a rule, what happens to you? Does this seem complicated? This is the first step. Number 2, identify and remove violations. For global platforms with billions of users across hundreds of countries and languages, this is, to put it mildly, tough. Quote, a large platform like Meta must find employees who speak dozens of languages and hundreds of dialects. Those people are expected to make decisions about everything from terrorism to bullying to nudity, both recognizing local slang and social context while applying global rules independently of social and political mores in a particular location, end quote. Of course, much of this happens with software and automations and user reporting of material, but in the latter case, unfortunately, user reports are notoriously inaccurate because people tend to just report whatever they don't like rather than what's actually a violation of platform rules. Number 3, in the past, the decision about potentially rule-violating content was binary. You leave it up or take it down. Now there's a great many options to restrict features to certain users, to warn those users or accounts to blur out images, or to add context or warnings to content. Number 4, most content removed is not a matter of law enforcement. You don't gotta call the police on them. In fact, it rarely is. Even of the 34 million pieces of terrorist-related content Meta removed in 2021, the vast majority of it was only tangentially related to terrorism, but was removed out of an abundance of caution and an inability for automated systems to distinguish between different levels of harm. In fact, a funny anecdote from this card on this point was that there were teenagers in some country who were uploading profile pictures on Facebook of Osama bin Laden so that their accounts would immediately be deleted. And this was just a technique they used to delete their accounts. It had nothing to do with terrorism. They just knew that this picture got their account deleted easy. Sometimes, however, law enforcement is needed. Quote, direct, acute, real-world harm is organized online. Many companies operate legal teams to receive, parse, and respond to warrants and other legal requests about such material, end quote. Number 5. Companies may also share image hashes with the GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which helps online platforms to track and combat terrorist-related material across platforms. I imagine, although Fisherman doesn't specifically mention it, that there are similar systems for other highly objectionable internet content to report them to a central database so you can take them down across platforms, not just within them. Number 6, educate users. Part of preventing violations and responding to them when they happen is by educating users, either before a user posts or after a system has detected that the user has or may have violated a rule. And that is it. That is, in essence, how platforms regulate content these days. Okay, we have made it past the background. Congratulations. Now, affirmative. Should Section 230 be repealed? Over the years, Section 230 has attracted a small but ardent following of people who view it with the same kind of idealistic veneration, more often reserved for the First Amendment. Another article of faith among 230's champions, that people who criticize the law have no clue what they're talking about. Gillett Edelman, 21. The critical step is to have the debate, and for that we need to overcome the cult of Section 230. God did not command that the internet be treated differently from all other media. Dean Baker, 23. We'll start with what I see as the strongest line of argumentation for affirmative. Big tech has too much power, its harms are too great, and removing Section 230 protections would efficiently limit these downsides. On the status quo, social media is bad. First, it's bad for our public discourse, as misinformation, disinformation, and bad ideas can spread quickly and globally. Second, it's bad for democracy. It enables large-scale election interference by foreign powers, namely Russia, but others as well. It amplifies polarization, siloing Americans into political camps and convincing them that half of their fellow Americans are enemies. On this point, NYU psychologist Jonathan Haidt says, quote, Since the birth of the big tech media platforms 15 years ago, democracies around the world have been subjected to a grand experiment. Can a nation's news and information infrastructure, which is the lifeblood of any democracy, be dependent on digital technologies that allow a global free speech zone of unlimited audience size, combined with algorithmic non-human curation of massive volumes of misinformation, which can be spread with unprecedented ease and reach? The evidence has become frighteningly clear that this experiment has veered off course, like a Frankenstein monster marauding across the landscape. End quote. Third, it's bad for mental health, vastly amplifying body image issues, decreasing life satisfaction by comparison with airbrushed and idealistic avatars, and spreading toxic behavior and ideas. That's to say nothing of the addictive dopamine treadmill effects that have turned swaths of our modern society, probably including you and definitely including me, into zombies, normalizing cell phone addiction as much as cigarettes were normalized in the 1950s. Fourth, it's bad for our physical health, disrupting sleep and encouraging physical inactivity. And lastly, or at least to wrap up this short list, there are massive privacy and digital footprint concerns that have bitten and may come to bite a great many social media users who have the illusion of privacy in their personal messages or Finsta accounts. Big Social creates these harms in society and then uses them to reap massive profits. Steve Waldman is a famous computer programmer. He writes about Section 230, quote, "The law lets large sites benefit from network effects. I'm on Facebook because my friends are on Facebook, while shifting the cost of scale like shoddy moderation and homogenized communities to users in society at large. That's a bad deal. Congress should revise Section 230. When the law was enacted in 1996, the possibility that monopolies could emerge on the internet seemed ludicrous, but the facts have changed, and now so must our minds." End quote. It's important to note here that although negative may want to turn the big tech power argument by saying big tech offers more benefits than harms, big tech is good, they may also agree on this point but instead turn the link, saying that removing Section 230 protections will help big tech, not harm it. So if you are running for straight social media bad contention, you'll need to prepare for negative teams who think social media and big tech is good, and those who think that social media and big tech is bad. More on that in the negative section. So prepare for actually like a status quo and link turns, not impact turns, but also impact turns. I mean, be prepared, right? Okay. On solvency, repealing Section 230 would not kill the internet, but it would dethrone the tech giants that Americans from all perspectives fear and hate. Waldman writes, quote, "Without it, the firms that dominate the internet as we have come to know it could not exist. Maybe that would be a good thing. Services such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are not mere distributors. They make choices that shape what we see. Without Section 230 protections, these firms would be publishers, liable for all the obscenity, defamation, threats, and abuse that the worst of their users might post. The internet is not Facebook or Twitter, and it shouldn't be." Next, impact. Public discourse. In the early days of the internet, there were forums and blogs where small communities could gather, create culture, and regulate themselves by the norms of their communities. And that makes sense. A vegetable garden community is different from a manga community, which is different from a BDSM community. There are different standards that are appropriate across these different forums. As the relative power of big tech decreases, these small community forums may again open up. And again, that would be a good thing. And again, Waldman 21, quote, "A more plural internet would be a freer internet, as different communities would have wildly divergent standards about permissible expression. By creating the conditions under which we are all herded into the same virtual space, Section 230 helped turn the internet into a conformity machine." Microplastics. The next section consists of multipliers on social media, big tech is bad arguments. As new, powerful social technologies evolve, they bring with them previously unknown ways to spread insidious messages to minds around the globe. The first multiplier is algorithmic recommendations. This is a big part of the Section 230 literature. These calculate what content to feed to you next on social media, rather than just providing to you whatever you want to search for. This is the whole swiping phenomenon. This is the engine through which social platforms drive engagement and keep people glued to their phones for hours at a time, maximizing ad views and therefore maximizing profit, regardless of what it does to their users. Section 230 unfortunately protects these algorithmic designs. Theodore Wold is the Solicitor General of Ohio. This is a long quote, but it's an excellent one. Platforms want Section 230 to immunize their proprietary recommendation algorithms. This expansive view of Section 230 should alarm all Americans because it represents an industry asking for the unthinkable: complete immunity from civil liability for harms caused by the very core of its profit-generating business. It is comparable to Exxon seeking legal immunity for all of its drilling-related activities, or Southwest Airlines seeking immunity for all activities related to air travel, or Ford seeking immunity from claims related to the manufacture of any wheeled vehicle. Such sweeping immunity would perversely incentivize the underlying companies to seek profits no matter the human cost. Under big social media's self-serving reading of Section 230, social media platforms are free to engineer their algorithms for maximum profitability, regardless of the tangible human consequences. This is not the same as offering customers what they ask for or what they want to see. The algorithm shows users what they will watch. A healthy 16-year-old girl struggling with her changing body will watch content about managing one's body weight through disordered eating. A bored 13-year-old boy will watch viral videos of deadly challenges. A suicidal teen will watch content in which other users contemplate suicide. End quote. So again, these companies are using this powerful, powerful technology to reap massive profits at the expense of society and users. Next, the second multiplier is paid advertising. By the way, I think there are probably many of these I have for you in this lecture, only 2, but there are likely a great many more. With paid advertising, with enough money, you're able to show nearly any message you want to the world. That's greatly extending the reach of defamation, disinformation, election tampering, or any other malicious message. The staff of the Aspen Institute write, "Today, paid advertising and post-promotion are used by bad actors to promote questionable health cures and by political campaigns to smear opponents and drive voter suppression. There should be a higher standard of care when platforms are offering tools that enable amplification beyond organic reach of the service. In these cases, we recommend that Section 230 immunity no longer apply." End quote. Finally, for pro, some real-world evidence about how Section 230 protections have gone too far. So it is one thing to criticize big tech from the armchair, from the sofa, but another altogether to present cases that just strike you and hopefully strike a judge in the gut as unjust and in need of reform. Perhaps the most infuriating aspect of Section 230 is that it protects platforms from liability for crimes committed even when they're fully aware of these crimes being committed. So Edelman 21 in the Unjust Protection Card in the brief writes about 3 cases. 1, The Dirty, a gossip site where user-submitted posts can accuse people of being cheaters, gold diggers, or worse, often spreading malicious rumors and ruining lives. It's legal. Why? Because the users submit the post, not the platform. 2, ripoffreport.com, which gathers user-submitted negative reviews and publicizes them online, blackmailing businesses with a pay-to-promote better content, not exactly pay-to-remove system. This site has attracted repeated defamation lawsuits. Again, it's legal. Blackmail is totally legal because the users submit it, not us. And 3, Arms List, the Craigslist of guns, which actively facilitates illegal weapon sales. Users, not us. In all these cases, courts have sided with the companies on the grounds that the platforms cannot be held responsible for user-submitted content, despite the fact that said content is clearly illegal. 2, defamation. Most of the focus on Section 230 surrounds defamation, which is lying about someone and thus tarnishing their reputation, often with economic consequences. This is, you'll hear the terms slander and libel, which are both types of defamation. Donald Trump and his former Twitter account is a prime example. Without Section 230, his account would have been removed probably after his, second tweet, third tweet, as lying about people to damage their reputation is one of his favorite things to do. With Section 230, nearly anyone can get away with it. Dean Baker writes on this point, quote, "To my view, this is the best argument for altering Section 230. There is no good reason that internet intermediaries should be exempt from the same sort of liability for spreading defamatory statements as print or broadcast media. Treating them in a symmetric manner would be a big step forward." End quote. And traditional news sites are responsible for lying. Traditional news sources, because actually if the BBC, for example, has something on the internet, Section 230 applies. CNN, internet applies. But if it's on TV, newspaper, etc., magazine, Section 230 does not apply. So Fox News, for example, recently settled with Dominion Voting Systems for $800 million after Fox and its hosts spread stories about the lack of reliability about Dominion's voting machines. This is the defamation standard that platforms should also be held to. Next, radicalization. The most recent Supreme Court challenge to Section 230, at least the last big one, was decided May 2023, Gonzalez v. Google. In this case, the family of Nohemi Gonzalez, an American exchange student killed in the 2015 Paris ISIS attacks, sued Google for its YouTube recommendation algorithm that selectively showed ISIS videos to those most likely to become extremists, thus aiding ISIS in its recruitment efforts. Again, you watch one, you get another, etc. Perversely, the case was decided in favor of Google, as have similar cases charging big tech with aiding extremists, including Force v. Facebook, Twitter versus Tamina. Alliteration, man. The court decided for Google, but as Cost of 22 writes, quote, "The court was not enthusiastic in ruling against the Gonzalez family, with Judge Morton Christen writing for the majority that despite its ruling, we agree the internet has grown into a sophisticated and powerful global engine the drafters of Section 230 could not have foreseen." End quote. Regardless of the technicalities, though, it should be obvious to anyone's gut that big tech cannot be allowed to freely make money off of radicalizing citizens with its powerful and destructive technology. Section 230 should be abolished to end this perversion. We should abolish Section 230. Now, neg, we should not abolish Section 230. Section 230 is not the pixie dust making the internet a magical place for free speech and innovation. Gilad Edelman, 21. We will start the negation with the practical economic stock arguments that make up the important foundation for some of the other arguments. Repealing Section 230 would lead to a flood of lawsuits, harming small companies and killing innovation, while concentrating power in the only companies that are able to combat litigation at scale: big tech. Libel, slander, and misinformation are all common on social media, yet social platforms aren't accountable for it in the same way as CNN or NBC News, who have maybe one host speaking at a time, one team writing the script, because for big tech or any tech, any social platform, reviewing and approving millions or billions of posts made each day would be impossible. If 230 were overturned, each and every person who slanders a company or a person is an entry point to a lawsuit against a digital platform. Derek Bombauer and others talk about these lawsuits in the brief. And remember that lawsuits aren't just innocent people versus evil platforms, David and Goliath. No. Lawsuits can be weaponized and used by anyone for malicious ends. Fisherman 23 writes about how this happened in Italy. Quote, "Adjustments to 230 risk litigation by violent or hateful actors against platforms themselves. In the US, such lawsuits from white supremacists are now routinely dismissed based on Section 230. By contrast, in Italy, a neo-fascist group successfully sued Meta. Meta now faces an order to pay fines directly to the neo-fascist group itself. End quote. Big companies with big money and big lawyers will likely be able to weather whatever lawsuits come their way. Their potential competition, however, including startups and competitions, won't make it. So this removes competition and really helps big tech to get bigger. Derek Bombauer is a University of Arizona law professor. He writes, quote, "To the extent one is concerned about the size of platforms, if we worry about the big part of big tech, these increased expenditures will be counterproductive. Larger firms will be much better poised to navigate the changing legal landscape and to shape it." End quote. Edelman21 writes in the same vein, quote, "Perhaps the biggest tech companies could handle this, but the burden would crush smaller upstarts. Tweaking Section 230 this way, in other words, would actually benefit monopolies while stifling competition and innovation." End quote. And that leads to the flip side of helping big tech, hurting small tech. The companies without the legal muscle and financial might to fend off lawsuits. Cameron Carey, a global thought leader on privacy and former acting secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce, writes, quote, "Requiring content moderation would pose untenable obligations for many smaller company providers that do not have the capacity that large corporations like Facebook do to both automate some of the screening content as well as to engage, in Facebook's case, many thousands of human content moderators to review posts and make content decisions." End quote. And Ryan Nabel, a research fellow at the Comparative Enterprise Institute, quote, "It is no surprise that, unlike Facebook, second-tier online platforms and businesses, such as Wikimedia Foundation, TripAdvisor, and Reddit, have strongly opposed removing Section 230 protections." End quote. I think this, by the way, would be some excellent arguments, would be running Reddit, running Wikipedia. These will be taken down, so all the benefits they provide won't be around anymore in AF's world. And let's talk about that more. So these are some impacts specifically for the small tech destruction argument. First, innovation. New companies can't start because of the litigation, so new and hopefully better platforms will never see the light of day. In as far as new ideas and new technologies are beneficial, repealing 230 would be a disaster. Jason Kelly writes, quote, "Just as important as currently existing services and platforms are those that don't exist yet, because without Section 230, it would be cost prohibitive to start a new service that allows user-generated speech." End quote. The second impact is public services. Many platforms already exist that primarily serve as public forums. Some of these make a profit like Reddit and some don't like Wikipedia. But in any case, the massive good that these services provide to the public would be erased overnight by a repeal of 230. Michelle Paulson is Wikimedia's general counsel lawyer. She says in an interview when asked what would happen to Wikipedia if the platform were accountable for all user-posted content, "We probably wouldn't exist anymore. Simple as that. Lawsuits are costly when you win, but they're even more costly when you lose. If the Wikimedia Foundation could be held legally liable every time there was a good faith inaccuracy on its projects, we would have most likely been sued out of existence pretty early on, and we would never have had the chance to grow into what we've become, which is the largest repository of free knowledge in the world, accessible to all." End quote. That is on competition. Next, some theoretical arguments about how Section 230 upholds some basic freedoms and how repealing Section 230 will harm those basic freedoms. First, freedom of association. The First Amendment protects freedom of association. That means you can hang out with whoever you want to hang out to. That right is not protected in every country and hasn't historically. But it also means that businesses can choose not to associate with whoever they want, which means that under the First Amendment, they're free to take down whatever material they don't want to have on their platform. Yet, according to Matthew Feeney, a director at CAT, anti-230 activists, like the Affirmative, often target this very right. Quote, Each proposed bill undermines the freedom of association, free enterprise, the First Amendment, or security and privacy, end quote. Again, in attacking 230, you are really attacking the rights that are already guaranteed in the Constitution, which typically are those in the First Amendment. Speaking of the First Amendment, free speech. While the freedom of speech online isn't a right per se, the internet has maximized that right by allowing anyone in the country, no matter how marginalized or isolated, some connection with the world and some voice online. You find your community, you find your people. Repealing Section 230 would put that benefit in jeopardy. Will Duffield, a Cato policy analyst, says, quote, demanding that platforms assume liability for their users' speech will at best exacerbate the accidental removal of innocent speech. However, it also runs the risk of limiting who can speak online at all. Without Section 230, platform moderators would not become more deliberate, they would simply remove more, end quote. Johnson and Castro, 21, gives some details about what type of content might be removed en masse, and then talk about marginalized groups, so these two quotes back to back. Online services would err on the side of removing more content, even if that content is permissible, rather than risk leaving up content that would land them in legal trouble. They could even ban entire categories of speech, such as political speech, or category of users, such as elected officials. Limiting or removing Section 230 would also have a detrimental effect on marginalized populations. If websites and online platforms start censoring potentially objectionable content in order to avoid liability, controversial speech will likely be the first to go. In a world where controversial is defined by the majority, the internet would become yet another forum where the majority has the power to censor minority opinions, end quote. Last, freedom of the press, also from the First Amendment. What a great amendment. Much like with speech, while freedom of the press doesn't constitutionally extend to the internet, specifically, the internet does empower citizen journalism in a bigger way than ever before, obviously, right? Removing 230 protections would also threaten this status quo that everyone can be a journalist. Bombard 21 in the journalism card speaks a bit on this. One potential argument to draw your attention to is the cop watching, the police watching practice, which is filming police encounters and therefore holding them accountable, again, a kind of citizen journalism. Without Section 230 protections, Bombard suggests that this newfound accountability for police forces may be threatened. Again, one example out of a multitude of examples of how freedom of the press through citizen journalism is empowered by Section 230 and how removing it would be a travesty. Okay, that is it on freedoms. Finally, this is not an argument per se. It is a grab bag of results that would happen if Section 230 were repealed. So, an analogy that Midjourney has helped me represent here, the internet has grown around Section 230, much like a beanstalk grows around a trellis. So imagine trying to rip a trellis out from under a vine. If the vine survives at all, it'll be in a sorry state. The same will happen to the internet if 230 is repealed. So the following, they're not grand economic arguments or lofty philosophical arguments about freedoms. They're just some natural consequences of tearing out the backbone of the internet. As such, they're a bit of a grab bag of harms, much like the multitude of things that would go wrong for our poor beanstalk here. First result of chopping down the internet's trellis will be to enable the more extreme anti-abortion laws of states like Texas, heard it called Saudi Arabia, to be weaponized against any platform that hosts educational content about abortion information or where to get an abortion. Evan Greer and Leah Holland, both American activists, write, quote, Section 230 is the last line of defense keeping reproductive health care support, information, and fundraising online. Under Section 230, internet platforms that host and moderate user-generated content cannot generally be sued for that content. It does not provide immunity from the enforcement of federal criminal laws, but crucially, it does protect against criminal liability from state laws, end quote. Of course, if you are anti-abortion, if you are pro-life, and your district, your circuit, your judges, crucially, are the same, maybe run this as pro, I don't know. Or, yeah. In any case, repealing this will mean that information about abortions and abortion accidents will grow increasingly scarce. Although abortion access is a hot topic and widely publicized, my guess is that this is one of the great sea of state laws that would come into play if Section 230 were abolished, changing the internet in a multitude of ways that are difficult to imagine. Brennan et al. 23 talks about this general principle of internet companies having to comply with all the different specific state laws. Section 230 was enacted in part to create a national standard that would prevent tech companies from having to comply with 50 different regimes, end quote. So that is the national standard versus state law argument. I think a ton of very good material to mine here. But obviously the abortion one is the big one. The one a lot of people are talking about, a lot of literature on this. Next is FOSTA. This is just an example. We mentioned in the background section, it's legislation to exclude sex trafficking material from Section 230 provisions. However, even this very small carve-out, of all potential carve-outs, which a lot of people are proposing a bunch of different ones, this one, it caused nothing but chaos. It reduced law enforcement's efforts to rescue sex trafficking victims. It put sex workers in greater danger, and platforms that supported the sex worker community were reduced or shut down. Eric Goldman writes in a decidedly pro-230 piece, quote, "A good argument can be made that FOSTA benefited no constituents. It only harmed communities. If so, it would represent the worst kind of legislative policy, and repealing it would make communities better off without disadvantaging other communities," end quote. Okay, the best status quo good card that I have is from Fisherman 23. He says that tech companies already go above and beyond in controlling content on their platforms compared to what the government could reasonably mandate if 230 were repealed. In other words, it really could be the case that you repeal 230 and you have way less regulation counterintuitively. The companies are doing a great job as is, so why change the status quo and bring all these harms to bear? Repealing 230 could incentivize, one, through different mechanisms, over-regulation of legitimate political discussion, and two, less regulation and reporting of legitimate threats. Last on this grab bag is bots. Bots are automated programs that do actions like posting online, fetching information, or messaging someone without human intervention. Some of these bots are helpful, like customer service bots, and some are not like scam bots. If you know about Reddit bots, those are, I hate most of them, but a lot of people love them. They're often given as an example of like good bots, but I hate them. Repealing 230 may take away protections from platforms to take down the malicious bots, or else try to avoid liability by removing all bot interactions, including those of helpful bots like plugins to integrate Facebook with other services. So this all is written up by Casey Strickland. She's a research analyst with CAN in the Strickland 21 card. Okay, so after all of that information, all of those arguments, where do you stand on Section 230, or what arguments are you excited to run in your debates? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Remember to be kind to yourself and those around you. I love all of you. Thank you for being here. See you next month for the February 2024 topic.